So the study of logic serves as a way of educating our basic common sense abilities. And we're all more or less endowed with a set of abilities to recognize obvious contradictions in reasoning, to recognize when people are insulting one another, to recognize when we're being distracted by things that are irrelevant to the details of an argument. We're pretty good at seeing obvious non sequiturs, and I'll say a little bit about what a non sequitur is in a minute. And at least in modern 21st century United States, we're all pretty well able to manage obvious arithmetical errors. And so this sort of cluster of abilities we might associate broadly with something like common sense. Of course, common sense is a very vague term. It's not a technical term. It's actually a term that was appropriated from medieval philosophy, and it meant something entirely different in that context. But when we talk about common sense, we're thinking about the sort of the basic set of abilities that we can assume an adult in 21st century America would possess. And that really has to be our starting point. And so what we're going to do in a logic course or in a critical reasoning course is we're attempting to educate common sense. So it's pretty much the only starting point we have. And we're hopeful, or we're hoping, that by studying formal methods and by studying reasoning and argumentation in detail, we can improve our existing common sense abilities. So none of us believes that we're perfect in reasoning, or if you do, you're wrong. But most of us recognize that we're fallible. We regularly make mistakes. We regularly reason incorrectly. We regularly make poor decisions, etc. If you don't recognize that about yourself, you should pause and think about errors you've made in your own life and mistakes you've made. So if we've been wrong about a lot of things in the past, if we've made errors in reasoning in the past, then we should be somewhat skeptical with respect to our own ability to reason going forward. So what we're going to ask is that we adopt a kind of fallibilism with respect to our own capacities. So we're going to recognize that we could be better than we currently are. So what are some of the obstacles, some of the problems? Well, we're driven by habits. We're driven by strong associations. We're limited in various ways. So we have serious cognitive limitations. We have limits on our memory, etc. All of which mean that while common sense might have worked really well for our ancestors, let's say 50,000 years ago, common sense might have sufficed to take care of all of the problems and opportunities that our early hominid ancestors had. Common sense by itself is no longer sufficient to take care of modern problems. So if you're trying to figure out your retirement accounts, if you're trying to make decisions about, I don't know, financial regulation or climate change or even, basic savings using a credit card, how insurance works, et cetera, et cetera. Common sense by itself won't be a good guide. You'll need something more. You'll need to supplement common sense. So, as I was saying, basic common sense abilities certainly served our early ancestors very well, and the survival of our species depended on those kinds of basic abilities. But you can see that our hunter-gatherer ancestors weren't faced with the challenges of complex rhetorical manipulation in advertising or in political propaganda. They weren't required to evaluate risks in complex situations the way we are, or benefits in complex situations the way we are. So developing our appreciation then for formal reasoning is the first step, and understanding that we're frankly not equipped without formal reasoning to make good decisions. Recognizing that is the first step towards achieving excellence in logic. So, okay, so what are we doing here? Well, studying logic is a particularly effective way of understanding what are called arguments. And an argument, by argument, we don't mean a squabble or a disagreement. We don't mean any kind of contentiousness necessarily. So by argument, logicians mean, or philosophers and logicians mean, a finite sequence of sentences that's intended to convince an audience of some claim. So if we look at this, we've got a couple of parts that we'll look more closely at as we go forward. So we're trying to convince an audience, for sure, to accept some claim. So the claim here would be, we'll call it later on, we'll call it the conclusion of an argument, or the main contention. And what we're primarily interested in a course like this is the set of sentences, a set of sentences. So we're treating arguments as sentences here. Okay, so it's possible, and I think it's probably correct, to see sometimes, for example, a video, let's say a commercial advertisement, which is just a series of images, that could also constitute something like an argument. But what we're primarily focused on here is arguments that are delivered either in spoken or written form. So we're concerned primarily with sentences. And presumably, even if we were talking about images, we would treat the images as standing for some set of propositions or claims about the way the world is. So they're sequences of sentences. That's what an argument is. And it's a sequence of sentences that's meant to, or that's intended to, convince the audience of something, or to lead them to accept a claim. So ideally, we're looking for rationally persuading or rationally persuasive sequences of sentences that lead an audience to accept some conclusion or contention. This at least is what philosophers intend by the word argument. So we've already begun to see that it's a very specific characterization. It's only some sentences count as arguments. So for example, a shopping list doesn't count as an argument, a command doesn't count as an argument, et cetera, et cetera. So it's certain kinds of sequences of sentences in certain contexts that constitute arguments. Okay, so let's see. When we're looking at an argument, we're going to find already that, and I've already identified a part of an argument right here. So the part of the argument that I was indicating here is the conclusion of the argument. But arguments start from somewhere, they make some moves, and they arrive at a conclusion. So let's take a look. Oops. I don't know why this isn't working. There we go. So the three main parts of an argument then are the premises, the inferences, and the conclusions. Okay, so the conclusion we know is the main contention. It's what the argument is intended to rationally persuade us to accept. The inferences in an argument are going to be a large part of what we study here, and those are basically the moves of the argument. And the moves take us from premises, and we'll talk about that in a second, to the conclusion. So the premises, when we use the word premise, we mean something like an assumption. So what it is that an argument is intended, or what it is that an argument is resting on. These are the starting points in an argument. So if you think, for example, of your study of geometry, geometrical proofs have to begin somewhere, and in Euclidean geometry, geometrical proofs began with axioms. They began with basic things that one has to assume. Then from the axioms, Euclid derived theorems. And theorems are claims that result from the axioms plus some pattern of reasoning. Okay? So For us, obviously the premises are going to be, or often are, contentious. So a good critical thinker will carefully examine the virtues or the vices of the premises. So we'll say, well, is this assumption that you're making, is it true? What's the source of this? What's the source of your evidence? How can we determine whether or not it is true? So how do you know? So the first task of a critical thinker is to question the assumptions driving an argument. So we have to determine whether the premises are true or not. Okay? So is it true what you're assuming? The next major task ahead of us has to do with determining the quality of the inferences. So if we know that the premises are good, we can still generate a bad argument or have a bad argument because the inferences are bad. And we'll talk about the way inferences are bad today a little bit. And then finally, the conclusion. If the premises are good, if the inferences are good, and they lead you to the conclusion, then you have to accept the conclusion. Okay? And the conclusion, remember, is the main contention. It's the purpose of the argument.